Hey everyone, welcome back. I want to tell you about something that I'm starting. It's a locals community at talkingtotheinternet.locals.com. My goal with this community is to bring together a group of people who are interested in talking to the internet, whether they are experienced people who talk to the internet all the time, or whether they're individuals who want to actually start talking to the internet or want to get more experience to talking to the internet. Maybe you're somebody who just wants to run an idea by somebody, or you want to look for a co-host for a certain show. My hope is that talkingtotheinternet.locals.com can be a place where we all come together and have a good community that figures out what it's like to talk to the internet and how best to talk to the internet, and just can kind of share stories about our experiences talking to the internet. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to go check out talkingtotheinternet.locals.com. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is, if you can, support the folks who are on the show, support the guests. Jason publishes a lot of different material at Six Colors and podcasts at the Incomparable Network. Stephen Hackett runs the Relay FM network, right? So you can become members of both of those entities. James Thompson makes software. He guests on a lot of different podcasts as well, but he makes software called PCalc and Dice by PCalc. So if you can, support him through those ventures. Rosemary Orchard not only does multiple different shows, but she also wrote a book about OmniFocus, right? So if you can go support them, I know that as independent content creators, especially in the times that we're in right now, they would appreciate your support in that way. So thanks again for being back here. Thanks for supporting the show. Thanks for downloading. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for listening. And now we'll get to the show. Thanks so much. Welcome to Talking to the Internet. This week I have the privilege of having Dan Moren on. Dan writes all over the internet in the technology space. He also writes actual books, and he talks a lot on the internet in terms of podcasting. So it is with a great privilege, and I'm excited to have a good conversation today with Dan Moren. So Dan, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, man. I like that you say that I write all over the internet because it makes me feel like I'm scrawling just on like a graffiti artist, just all over the internet.
Did you ever see Hypothesis? Are you familiar with that software?
No, I don't think so.
So when I was doing my PhD, Hypothesis was a tool basically, and it was like a layer that went over top of the internet. And you could go in and you could annotate like web pages, or you could, read PDF documents off the internet. And you could annotate them, and it would save the annotations. And then there was this whole collaborative thing, and it still exists. I just don't know if it's any good. But that's what that made me think of, is you.
That's wild.
Going in Hypothesis and like scribbling all over all the technology stuff. So.
Yeah, it's very quality. We won't discuss how quality that is, but there you go.
Well, Dan, can you get us started on? You've done a lot of things, and you do a lot of things. Can you get us started on how and why, you started talking to the internet?
Sure. Yeah. Short answer is I've been doing it for a really long time in one form or another. I would go, frankly, all the way back to when I was in high school, because one of my earliest sort of forays on the internet was. My good friend, one of my best friends from high school, a guy named Jason Tossi, and I started in the early to mid 90s a electronic magazine that was based on basically short stories of science fiction and fantasy and horror and that kind of stuff. And we originally distributed it on like bulletin boards. If you want to go back, I'm going to date myself now. Bulletin boards that were sort of like, local dial-up places where you would post things. And we started out there, and then the web came along it was, I think, probably started around the same time that we were starting on this. And after a year or two of doing that, we moved to the web. And so, and we published, both Jason and I were like big, aspiring writers. And so that was sort of where we're like, hey, we could write stuff and we could publish it on the internet. Crazy, right? And so I think that's kind of where part of my fascination with that started. I'd been writing stuff for a long time. Basically as long as I've been able to actually, pick up a pen or pencil and write stuff on a piece of paper, I'd been writing stories. And I'd always had an interest in writing. And so that was the first time we had a real outlet for like, well, let's put stuff online. And because we were lucky enough to grow up in an age where, we were coming into our teenage years literally at the same time that the web was really starting out and the internet was starting to take off, it seemed like kind of a natural outlet. And so, that ended up being a thing that we did for a few years. And that was sort of like one of my first, entrees into publishing stuff on the internet. I'd always had an interest in technology, and that was sort of the other big prong of my life. I started reading Macworld magazine when I was around that age as well, not long after I got my first Mac, which was in the early 90s. And so I think those two things dovetailed really nicely for me because I had this sort of interest in technology and I had the interest in, creativity and writing. And so those were sort of my two big passions when I was a teenager and growing up. And I worked mostly like in my entire professional life in one capacity or the other. I spent a few years after I graduated college working as an IT professional and doing web development. And then I transitioned into writing about technology, which was sort of my first big break into being a professional writer when I was 25 or 26. And so it was nice way to combine those two things to be able to say, I know a lot about technology and I love writing and I can sort of put those together into something. And because, the internet at that point had become much more popular, it was sort of a natural outlet for that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a long path, but it got me there in the end.
Well, okay, so help me understand something. It sounds like you came at this from more I'm a creative, right? Like I want to write stories and I want to share stories. The internet is happening right now. Let's see how we can use this, right? Through the bulletin board kind of web magazine. How did you, we live in an age where everybody wants to be viral, right? Like everybody wants to be a big hitter, an influencer, or whatever word you want to call it, right? How did you track whether or not anybody cared, anybody read anything? Like, were you just throwing it out into the ether, or was it, did you have a way to track that stuff?
No, not at all in those early days. Basically, in the mid 90s, the two things that would come up is one, if you were sort of, you got links from other places. And in those days, that was before Google, right? Like there were some search engine things, but a lot of what was out there were things like directories. Like Yahoo was a directory in the early days. They sort of cataloged and cultivated these links. And so we, links that would show up in there were pretty cool. We had a little bit written about us in the Boston Globe because we both grew up in suburban Boston. And so there was like a little, paragraph about us in a paper once because it was novel, right? Like, oh, these two guys have started this internet magazine.
Yeah.
And, then submissions. We would get submissions from people looking for a place to publish their writing. And that was cool. Like we did this for several years and it never, sometimes it felt like maybe we were like struggling a little bit to find stuff. And I won't speak as to the quality of a lot of the stuff that we published, not only from other authors, but from ourselves. Like, we were teenagers. We didn't really have a great idea of what we were doing. But yeah, there wasn't the fact that at least people seem to respond to it or submit stuff. And we did seem to every once in a while hear or find links to us in other places. I think that was kind of all you could hope for at that point, right? There was no social media. There was no search engine really. So there wasn't really a great way to gauge whether or not it was successful. And I think, that comes with its fair share of struggles because you do want to feel like what you're putting out there is getting received, right? You're not just broadcasting into the ether. But at the same time, I feel like because we were invested and passionate about doing it, and because we were, teenagers and we didn't need to do it for a living, we never made any money off of it. We never charged anything. We never, sadly, we weren't able to pay our submissions people, the people who submitted stuff to us either. But we had no money. We were teenagers. And so, that was, I think we just kept going with it because it was great to feel like we got stuff out there, right? Like so much, especially at that age. I remember the part of the reason that we started it was because I had submitted a story to, we're going to go deep nerdy here for a second. the Star Wars role-playing game, they had this thing they put out every once in a while called the Adventure Journal, which featured short stories or like role-playing game adventures. And I submitted something to it, and I was told that I was not able to get published because I was too young at that point. Which makes sense. I was a minor. I understand. But I was frustrated by that because I'm like, well, how am I going to get any better if I'm not able to publish things?
Yeah.
So the internet kind of let you do that, right? Like nobody, they like the old saying on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Like same thing with if you're, 15-year-old boy, nobody knows. You put stuff out there, and if it's good, maybe people respond to it. And if it's not, well, in those days at least, you didn't get as much abuse, I think.
Yeah.
It was just like people would just ignore it and move on to the next thing.
Oh, man. Okay, so, all right, so you start out of really internal motivation, right? Like you start out of this, we wanted to put something out there and tell our stories. When does it switch to, I mean, you said you were 25 when you got your first, freelance article, right?
Yeah.
Like, so mentally, when did you go, oh, I can do this thing and actually make money out of it, and it's different now?
Yeah, it actually came out of, so I was working this web dev IT job at a university here, and I liked doing some aspects of that job. I love helping people with technology, and that's one thing I like to do even with my writing. But like I worked at it was a small research program. There's maybe 20 people or less there. And I was responsible along with the other IT guy for just like everything, soup to nuts, all the hardware, all the software installs, like designing our website, all of that. And like parts of that were fun, but I got mired in a project that was like, this project will never end. I sort of like could project out and see like, if I stay here, I'll be working on this project for the next decade, and I'm not that excited about it.
Yeah.
And so the writing part had always been something I had done on the side. And while I was working at that job, I finally decided like, I'm going to buckle down, I'm going to finish a novel. And I managed to actually do that. And, I sent it out and I got rejection letters and stuff like that. And while I was working on that, I also ended up with this opportunity to write. It would have been 2005, and Revenge of the Sith, episode 3 was coming out. Most of my life is tied to Star Wars. Very quickly, you'll realize
understandable.
This.
It's understandable, right? Everybody's got to track it somehow, right?
And so I decided to write an essay about being a Star Wars fan in that era. And on a whim, a friend of mine had gotten some pieces published in the Boston Globe, and so he put me in contact with his editor, who put me in contact with another editor. I was like, look, I got this piece. I just, if you guys are interested, here it is. And they published it, which was wild to me. Like, I really did not quite... It was a sudden jump for me because I had gone from like, I'm just mucking around and I've got this thing and I'll put it out there and maybe somebody will bite, and they decided they would publish it. I will note I did not get paid for that either. In retrospect, now as a professional, I'm like, man, they should have paid me something for that.
Yeah, seriously.
But it, made into the paper. It was on the front page of the arts section next to the review of episode 3 when it came out. That was kind of crazy for me because it was like, I can't believe I actually got something published in like a piece of paper that you go and get off the newsstand. And so I started thinking more seriously at that point, like maybe I could do something with this. And I probably told this story elsewhere, but I basically, since I was tired of my job, I sort of went through and made a list of like, here, what are all the things I would like to do? And one of the things that came up was like, oh man, I've read Macworld magazine for 10 years. I would love to write for Macworld. I was a huge fan of the back page columns that used to be in there from people like Guy Kawasaki. Douglas Adams wrote one at one point. And just, all the really great sort of opinion articles that were in there. Those were my favorite part of reading the magazine. And so I thought, well, I'll reach out and I'll see what that might be like. And so I emailed the editor of the magazine at the time, who was Jason Snell, because he always put his email address at the bottom of his columns. I was like, hey, I'm interested in getting started as somebody who writes about technology. Can you make any suggestions? And he very nicely wrote back and was like, yeah, I suggest you maybe talk to these people and submit some stuff to one of the places he suggested is Tidbits, which is still around, which is run by my friend Adam Engst and Tanya Engst. I was like, great, that sounds awesome. And then I proceeded to not do that at all because I was a little bit lazy. And it took me a while to like get to the point where I was like, yeah, I'm ready to leave this, tech job that I'm at. And when I did that, I sort of took a break from things. And one of the things I did while I was taking a break was go out to Macworld Expo in San Francisco, which was still a going concern at that point because I'd always wanted to go. I'd never been able to go to an Apple keynote. And so I went there, and among the things that I did while I was there, I saw a panel that Jason Snell was on, and I was like, oh, that guy, I wrote him an email, and so I went up to him after the panel. I was like, hey, I sent you an email, a couple of years ago about writing for, Macworld or technology. And I sort of said, do you have any jobs available? And he said, well, we don't have any, we're not hiring like full-time jobs right now, but we are sort of ramping up a blog to cover Apple stuff that's a little bit different from what we do at Macworld, because their online presence was a little different in those days. It was a lot of like the sort of print stuff repurposed for online. It didn't have the same sort of conversational tone as a lot of the blogs that were up and coming in that age, in sort of the early mid 2000s. He's like, yeah, we might be looking for some contributors. Why don't you shoot me an email? And so, a month later or so, I shot him an email and I had some samples, and he basically was like, yeah, this looks great. Why don't you start writing for us? So I started writing for macuser.com, which was in early 2006. And I ended up writing a lot for them. We started out and he's like, well, let's just say, we'll pay you. It was a pretty low rate at those days. We'll pay you $5 for a blog post, and you can write 100 blog posts a month, let's say maximum. And I said, okay. And then I wrote 100 blog posts that month. Wow. And then I wrote 100 blog posts a month after that. And I just kept going. And I think they started up another blog around the same time called Gadget Box that was sort of a more generic tech blog. And I was one of the lead writers on that. And then they started, assigning me stuff from Macworld. Like they asked me to do some more pieces for the, Macworld.com. And I wrote a piece for the magazine. And it just sort of kept going. They asked me to do all these. I did a lot of menial things in those days. I used to review iPod cases, which is probably the worst gig in the world. Because after you've written about 50 reviews of iPod cases, you realize I have nothing left to say about iPod cases. And eventually they just decided, you know what? It'll be cheaper if we just hire you as a full-time staffer because you're doing so much work for us right now. And that was about a little over a year after I started blogging for them. And so I started working full-time for them, which was great.
And you were able to do the freelance stuff, the not one-off pieces, because, you're writing 100 in a month, right? So it's like, that keeps you really busy. But it's like you were able to do that for a year, and then they brought you in full-time. Like you weren't doing anything else then?
No, at that point, I was not. When I left my old job, I basically moved back in with my parents, which none of us were like super thrilled about. But, they were great. My parents are great, and they really supported the fact that I was going to sort of take a wild leap into the unknown on this. And the stuff, just because I was pumping out so much quantity for the Macworld, they did it. I didn't really have a lot of time to do other stuff. I sort of experimented here and there, and I tried to submit a few things. Nothing really took off, and the Mac user gig for me was so good, and I enjoyed it so much that I really didn't want to be doing anything else. I was like, I'm just gonna. This is one of my dreams, right? Like I've been wanted to write for Macworld, so I sort of threw myself into that with wild abandon, and the more the work they gave me, the more I was happy to take it on. And so it ended up being a really great fit because it was something I really wanted to do. They needed someone to handle like certain types of content that, they didn't necessarily have people to do at that point. It freed up a lot of the senior people to do more interesting stuff. And so I had an opportunity to really build out my own, set of my own repertoire, my own types of content, just got a lot of chance to write pretty much everything under the sun, which was a great experience at that age.
Yeah, so I don't want to skip forward through Macworld too much, but it's like, so you were writing for Macworld. How long did you do that?
I worked there full-time for 7 years.
Okay, and then I, that was kind of before I really started getting into, tech journalism and tech blogging and all that stuff, right? So I know you more through Six Colors, right? And I know you more through different things, but that's fairly recent. So what was that whole process like, going from big gigantic company to small indie, for lack of a better way to put it, publishing?
It's fascinating to me that you say that, just because I think of that as such a small chapter of my life, because in part because it's like the chapter I'm still in, right? You're like, oh yeah, I've only been doing that, and then I start thinking about the math. I'm like, I guess I've been doing that to close to as much time as I worked at Macworld now. Did not really put that one together. Thanks. I'm feeling a little older now. No, It was a big change. What was great about it, so what ended up happening, and this story is out there too, but essentially I and many of my colleagues at Macworld were laid off in the fall of 2014, right after the Apple announced the Apple Watch. And I kind of wasn't sure what to do with myself. And so one of the opportunities I got was that my boss at Macworld, Jason Snell, he and I have become very good friends, very frequent collaborators. While we were at Macworld, he's like, look, I'm leaving as well, and I'm going to start this site because I just want a chance to sort of do my own thing, go indie, write my own content, decide what I'm going to do. He's like, why don't you come and write some stuff for me? I was like, all right, that sounds like a good opportunity while I'm sort of trying to figure out what's next for me. And I did some other stuff while I was making that transition. I wrote for Popular Science for a little while. I did a bunch of freelance pieces for other sources. Six Colors was there as a nice little stable, venture. It's like I always had a place to put stuff if I wanted to write anything about technology. It was a great outlet for that. And Jason was spending a lot of time building sort of the brand of that. And I feel like it was very different. You didn't have the sort of support system necessarily that you did working at a big company, right? Like you didn't necessarily have I'm getting a steady salary. I have assignments that are handed to me by an editor a lot of the time. I have a very specific type of purview in terms of I'm supposed to be covering this area. I'm supposed to be writing this type of content. Whereas being in indie, it's a lot more freeform. It's a lot more what do I want to write about? What do I think is interesting? And honestly, I love the freedom of it. I think it's the thing that attracts me to it the most is the idea that it's not as regimented in terms of you need to produce X number of pieces every day. Because that was a big thing, especially in those early days when, I was on the verge of burning out a lot of times. Is you're pumping out 100 pieces in a month, that's 3 or 4 pieces a day. And that, even if they're short, that can be draining. It can be really, and it comes with a whole lifestyle of you're constantly on the prowl. You're constantly skimming all the headlines. You're reading, social media, as it were, in those days, or RSS or whatever, and just looking for something to write about. And that's a lot of pressure. And I think it's one of the things I hated the most about my job is always feeling like I had to be glued to a computer looking for that thing because you had to be producing content. And so being at Six Colors has been, we get to set our agenda. We get to decide how much we're going to write. We get to decide what we're going to cover. And it gives us a lot more freedom to do things that, maybe you couldn't develop as easily at a bigger site because you don't have the time or you're busy churning out, a bunch of quick hit pieces that cover sort of the news because people you need to keep them tuning in, right? You need to sort of put a stake in the ground. And if there's a news story, even if there's not something necessarily for you to say that hasn't been said by 100 different outlets already, you still need to cover it, right? If Apple issues a press release, you can't just be I don't care. That's not that interesting. No, you got to put your stake in the ground and you got to say something about it because people will show up at your site and be like, how come there's nothing about this? Whereas on an indie site, people come because they want to read the stuff we wrote and not just because they need to know what is the latest news that's happening all the time.
Well, yeah, and I've appreciated, I've seen this before, and I would assume that you're a similar way. There are times when you'll want to be on the front edge of that, right? And then there are times where you're like, okay, we're intentionally not going to be on the front edge of that, but we're going to go deep. We're going to do this angle on the story, or we're going to do this,
Absolutely.
This different thing. And it's I love getting the different perspectives from that, whereas okay, if I want, the it just hot off the presses kind of thing. I'm going to go here and I'm going to look here because they're going to give me the first look. But then if I want somebody who's really thought about it for a couple weeks, I'm going to go over here and I have an idea that they're going to have thought about it. So it's good to have all of those different perspectives in the field.
Absolutely, because so many of those ones that are about we got to get out and we got to be first. There's only so much information usually that's available. A lot of the sites that are covering sort of the breaking news angle, they're pulling from the same information, right? So you go to 6 different sites, they all kind of know the same thing because they haven't gotten to spend any time with it, right? They know if they're covering a product release, they know the specs, they know what the company has told them, but they don't really have a chance to say the experience of using a product for a long period of time. That's a different thing, right? And I think we do have the leisure of being able to say, we don't need to be first. we can take a week, we can take 2 weeks spending time with a device or with a piece of software or just with a piece of news and get a chance to sort of digest it and think about like, what are the actual implications of this and what does it look like a week or two after this thing comes out?
Okay, so you've been part of both the push and the pull, right? Where somebody's pushing you to make more, and then there's this, or I guess maybe it's the other way. Somebody's pulling you to make more, and then you're pushing out your own content. If you had to pick a good percentage, right? Like, what would you want that breakdown to be? Because I can imagine you'd want it to be a little bit of both, but what would you want that to be?
Yeah, I feel like I'm sort of like a 2/3. I want to decide what I want to write, and I'm gonna like do my thing and push it out. To probably about a third, like it's nice to have a hook every once in a while. It's nice to have somebody give you something and be like, see what you think about this, or look into this, or something like that. I think that is a good structure to have, and one big part of it is that it relies heavily on collaboration, right? Like if somebody else is sort of giving you something to do, a lot of times it's like, if you have a partner or a boss or whatever, it's them thinking, well, this is interesting. Why don't you take a look at this? And so you get a chance to trust their judgment. You get a chance to sort of bounce ideas off each other rather than being in that vacuum where you're like, I just need to come up with something to write today, or what do I want to talk about today? And sometimes, I write a weekly column at Macworld still, and like, some weeks are better than others when it comes to like, what am I going to write about this week? Because sometimes you're just sitting there staring at the screen for like an hour. Like, I know I can write a piece. I just need an idea. Yeah. And no amount of staring at this screen is giving me an idea any faster.
And you're at the stage now, right, where you've built your own personal brand and you've built your reputation up to where they say, hey, we want a weekly column from you on whatever you want to write it on, right?
Yeah, it's so when I pitched this, my column at Macworld's called Stay Foolish, and the sort of larger idea of it is usually like, let's analyze what's going on and sort of push things out to the future and see like, what are the implications of this going forward? And sometimes it's about where are the missed opportunities for Apple, or what is this leading to, right? Like we've seen them do X, Y, and Z. What does that suggest they might be working on? So it's that sort of analysis and opinion angle, I think, that is what people look for from me. And that's what I like writing about, because it's interesting to sort of synthesize that information, to look at the breadcrumbs and see like, what are the things that, a year from now we look back and we were like, it should have been obvious, right? Like we should have connected those dots and we would have known that they were about to deliver this amazing new product that does this. I think that's fun sort of puzzle solving for me.
Yeah. All right, so looking back on it, right, like you've written a lot of words on the internet. What do you wish you knew when you started, right? In terms from writing, let's just talk about writing, because we're going to make a switch here in a couple minutes to talking and actually speaking into a microphone. But it's like, what do you wish you knew about typing words and publishing them on the internet?
What do I wish I knew? Well, I think looking back, if I could give myself, one big piece of advice, and it's the advice I give to anybody who's interested in writing, is there's no magic to it. I like to say there's no voodoo to it. Like people are always trying to crack that secret of like, well, how do I become a writer? And the answer, as any good writer will tell you, is you write. That's it. Like, and I wish I had realized earlier that it's like, I don't need permission, or I don't need to find the perfect thing. I feel like in the mid part, like my late teens, early 20s, I spent a lot of time bogged down on like trying to come up with like the perfect thing. Like, this will be my magnum opus. And of course, when you're 20, like the idea that you've come up with your magnum opus already, unless you're, Mozart or whatever, it's pretty unlikely. You hopefully got a lot of life left in you. And so I feel like I wish I had just I wish I dove in earlier. And I think that's the big piece of, like I said, the big piece of advice I give everyone is just start doing it. And for me, certainly putting stuff out when I was a teenager was a good start. I wish I'd sort of stuck with that more. I wish I had understood the business a little better too. I think that's the other thing that I didn't know as much about when I sort of started out, is like, how does this work, right? Like, how does pitching work? How does getting assignments work? Like, how do you sort of, get to a point where it's not just about, I'm going to write stuff and put it out there, but that you're actually, working in that field as a professional? And again, the answer is, it's not that hard. You just kind of have to start doing it. And once you do, like, then you have stuff to show off. You have, samples and all that. And it's really, it's not untenable. Like, it's not to say it's not difficult and doesn't require a lot of perseverance, but that perseverance and hard work and dedication, all of that is superior to the idea that you need to be struck with lightning with some brilliant idea, or you need, a muse, or you need to wait for that sort of perfect opportunity to come along. You got to kind of make your own opportunities.
That's awesome. All right, so let's take off your typing hat, right?
All right.
Your keys on, or fingers on keyboard, and now let's go to talking into a microphone, because you do a lot of that too. You have Clockwise, you have Rebound, Inconceivable. You have I don't know if guest is the right word, but you're often on a lot of other incomparable shows. Mm-hmm. What got you started there, and how does that story unfold?
Podcasting is an interesting thing, right? Early 2000s probably is when it first started to come up, and it was very niche at that point. There were definitely people doing it, as they will often tell you, but it had not become a fully fledged thing. And I think a big part of that was you still had, it was in the era where people were relying on like iPods, and you would download stuff to your computer and you'd sync it to your iPod, and then maybe you listen to a podcast. So it's kind of niche. I think the big thing that changed that, obviously, is the introduction of the iPhone and the modern smartphone. All of a sudden, it was way easier to get these files, and once sort of bandwidth became a big thing, higher speed phones, then it was a lot easier to just be like looking at your phone and be like, oh, a podcast, press play. Mm-hmm. There it is. You removed all the friction. So my first real foray into podcasting, there were two. One was Macworld has had a podcast for a super long time. I did a bunch of segments for them when I worked there. And even before that, when I worked at Mac User, I would do the odd segment or two interview. I actually just found audio the other day from one of my first appearances on the Macworld podcast in like 2006 or 7, which was kind of wild. And then I briefly, my friend Tony Sindelar, who is a frequent Incomparable panelist as well, he and I had a really short-lived podcast that I don't think is anywhere on the internet anymore, which is probably for the best. It was like a dozen episodes of something. It was called the Doomcast, and it was mainly like just totally improv riffing on, like, we would have a handful of topics, and then we would just discuss these weird, bizarre topics in sort of a very like deadpan way. And then I'd cut it together later. It was fun. It was a great exercise. It was really early for both of us, and we didn't like really know what we were doing. And I think we had an audience of maybe like 10 people, including one of our friends who was at grad school. I feel like we made it just for him because he had these like long hours in the lab, and he'd be like, "Oh, I just need more episodes of your podcast."
Yeah, that's awesome.
Like, all right, that's very targeted.
Yeah.
In 2010. Jason Snell, who I mentioned already, and I know has been on your show already, he started The Incomparable. And the idea behind this was essentially he and a lot of our mutual friends, a lot of whom are tech writers, we're all giant nerds, and we liked talking about other stuff like movies and books and comics and all this stuff. And he's like, well, maybe we should try recording a podcast where we just discuss stuff. And so we were like, yeah, this sounds fun. Let's give it a try. And so in August of 2010, we started recording episodes of The Incomparable, which was in some ways, I don't want to say, is either ambitious or anti-ambitious, because we had these early episodes where we would cover like everything in a single genre. Like, let's talk about all the works of Joss Whedon in 1 hour. And we just didn't really have any sense of like, how long is this going to go, right? What is this a long-term project, or this is something we'll do for a few months and then we'll be like, yeah, that was a good run, but now we're done. But around that time, podcasting was really taking off. And so in addition to doing that, over at Macworld, we were launching some other brands at the time. And not long after that, Jason and I started a podcast called Clockwise, which was originally over at IDG, at the Tech Hive website that we launched. And the idea was, we'll have a couple guests on. We'll talk about a bunch of different technology topics. We'll make it 30 minutes because so many podcasts are really long. We'll do a nice short one. And so that was a lot of fun. We had a lot of our colleagues from IDG and the various different brands there, PC World and Mac World, and we would have them on. It would be a really great opportunity to talk about these things. And so we were lucky enough that when we left IDG in 2014, we were able to take the show with us and move it over to Relay FM. And Jason and I spent a while hosting that. And of course, Jason went on to some other stuff. And Micah Sargent's now my co-host over there. But it was really a great opportunity at the time. I think so many podcasts that started in that era were very freeform, right? Those very conversational, like there's 3 or 4 people on here and they're just going to talk about a subject. And so when we started Clockwise, a lot of that was born out of this idea of like, what if we tried something that was much more regimented, much more formatted, like a TV show that, you might watch, like a TV talk show. And so that really, I think, was one of the things that made that show really successful, is that it adhered to this very specific format. It had restrictions on time, and it had an order and a predictability to it that I think a lot of people really responded to. And so in those early days, being able to play with all these different formats and try out these different things, it was a great chance to really see what podcasting could do. And I liked it so much that I said yes to every opportunity that came along. So getting to do The Incomparable or Clockwise, getting to run my own game show, which was something I really was excited about doing, and I just had always dreamed of being able to do. I think it's a great medium to play around with all these different types of shows, and as we've seen from the explosion into podcasting, it's super popular because people really enjoy the format. And so I'm happy to have been on sort of one of the early edges of that. Obviously, I like so many things I feel like I do, it's gotten super popular in other places, right? Like people who came after me or even around the same time, their shows become those incredible viral sensations like you talk about. And I feel like that's great. We do a really solid, have a solid audience and a great community around so many of the shows that we do, that even if they're not, those, your Serial or whatever, it's still a really great experience. And the fact is that podcasting supports that in a way that a lot of other mediums don't, right? It's really hard to do movies or TV shows where it's like, we've just got this little small audience, but they're really devoted, right?
We did okay. No.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Exactly. Podcasting is nice that way. I really appreciate that about it.
And one of the things I love about it, right, is, it's the community aspect of it too, right? Because even though it's not true, I listen to Clockwise and, I think I'm part of this round table,
right,
this panel, right? And I even though I'm not saying a word, but I'm agreeing with different people when I'm doing these things, and it's I'm building this community that I'm actually not part of. But it doesn't matter if the community's big or small. It's just I know that it's there, and I know that or at least I feel like I'm part of something. So I love that about it.
Yeah, and you are part of it. I mean, I think that's the best part about it, is it does feel intimate in a way that a lot of other media doesn't. And moreover, because of the fact that it's on the internet, and because of the fact that now we have so many of these great independent podcasts, especially, that really flourished, a lot of those podcasts now have communities built up around them. Over at The Incomparable, we have a membership program, and we have, we have a Slack that's for members. And that's provided, a real community. I've seen groups in that Slack who have gone on and started their own podcast, or they now play D&D together, or they play online games together. And it's we did kind of foster that. We found
absolutely.
It was an ability for like-minded people to find a way to get together and find each other. And honestly, that's great. That's almost more gratifying than putting the show out there. It's the idea that you helped people connect with other people, and your show might have been incidental to that, but it still played a part.
Well, and you said about it is community. The other thing that I thought about as you were saying that was, if I send you a tweet or an email or something like that, there's a really good chance you're going to respond, because that it's not 8 million people all emailing the same person,
right,
or all throwing it, the fire hose into the person where they literally can't respond. Yeah. It's, hey, you said this thing the other day, and I just wanted to tell you that, here's my perspective on it. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But at the same time, there is a chance that it's going to hit your eyes, and that's cool.
Sure.
To know that that can happen is really cool.
Yeah, and it totally does. I mean, honestly, if you're Stephen King, you can't answer every piece of fan mail you get, right? But in our sort of smaller niche communities, I think I do try to respond to pretty much every email that gets sent to me. I don't respond to every tweet, but I probably have read it, because I'm a bit of a Twitter completionist at times. So yeah, there is a really good chance that I have almost certainly read your response, and a pretty good chance that I'll respond to it in some way. And I agree. I like that because it does feel engaging, and some of it is, again, because podcasting grew up alongside a lot of these other channels, like social media, right? People have been writing books for hundreds of years, But there wasn't necessarily like a way to get at those people, right? Like you could send them like a letter, but it might go into the void. But there wasn't really a lot of opportunity for a sort of a way to just be like, oh, hi, I just really like what you do, right? Like you might see them on the street if you're lucky. But because we have social media and email and all that stuff, it's a lot easier for people to write in and just be like, hey, you're easily reachable. I just want to say I like what you do, which incidentally is never a bad thing to do. Especially if you just want to say that, like, hi, I like your work. I do that with famous people I've run into all the time. And usually they're really nice about it because that's all they want to know is like, oh, thanks. Thank you for liking what I do.
Somebody enjoyed it. Yay.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I don't know a lot about The Rebound. I mean, I've listened to The Rebound, right, off and on for a while, but it's not one in my regular rotation, and I don't I don't feel weird telling you that. Like that's okay. But tell me how it started. Tell me how it developed. Where did that come from?
So, I mean, the podcast itself, as its title sort of jokingly suggests, it started around the time I joined Six Colors, which was essentially when I left Macworld. And I realized like, oh, I'm leaving. I'm going to have a lot more time on my hands. And I can also do stuff on the side that's about technology that's not, sort of bound by where I work, right? Like, so stuff that I did when I worked at Macworld, if it was technology related, it had to be for Macworld, basically. Like, I couldn't freelance. So the fact that I was suddenly like, oh, I no longer have an employer, boy, I love doing podcasts. It would be great to do a technology show. And so, my friends Lex Friedman and John Moltz, Lex used to work with me at Macworld. John has been a frequent, tech pundit and writer for years, and also, really in-depth Apple follower. They're good friends of mine. We always enjoyed just sitting around and shooting the breeze about technology. I was like, why don't we do a podcast? And they're like, oh, yeah, that sounds good. I suckered them into that. And, here we are 5 years later, and we're still going. And I think it was an opportunity for us to just have super casual conversations about technology. I think in some ways, I don't want to pick on the Accidental Tech Podcast guys, but I will because they're way more popular than us and they're way smarter than us. All those guys Marco, Casey, and John are all friends of mine. They do great work, but at the same time, we're like, what if there was a show for people who like that, but also like really stupid jokes? And that was kind of our niche, is like, we're like the Accidental Tech Podcast guys if they were a lot dumber and a lot shorter. That was the other thing. It was like, none of us had the time to do a 2-hour podcast. So we're like, we'll do a 45-minute podcast. It'll be kind of irreverent. And, just honestly, it's the kind of thing that we would do even if it weren't really being recorded, is we would just sit there and we would talk about technology. And it's the kind of thing that, when we used to do like Macworld Expo and shows like that, and you get together with your friends in the bar and you just be sitting around like talking about what happened that day or something that you learned, like that was kind of the atmosphere that we were going for. It's just something that was super casual. Like, you're not going to turn to it for hard-hitting analysis or the nitty-gritty technical details. But if you like just sort of kind of strange like weird jokes and just sort of hanging out with people, like that's kind of the response we get a lot of times, is like, I love listening to the show because it just feels like I'm hanging out with my friends. Yep. That's kind of what we aim for. So
and I think you hit it well. I really do think you hit it well, and like the rapport between the three of you is spot on. So I like that a lot.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's funny because just this morning I was looking something up and I came across an email I'd sent to John a decade ago, like literally almost 10 years ago, like in 2 days or something. And I was like struck by it in some ways because the tone, the content of the email was actually like quite a personal, serious thing. And I was like, wow, if I was trying to think back, like, how long have I known John? And I was realizing if I sent him this email that was like really this kind of personal email a decade ago, then we must have been friends for several years already at that point. I was like, oh no, I've known these people too long.
Yeah, you're really realizing time and age on this show. Jeez, maybe this
I'll
wasn't
bring
a good
it
idea.
home a little bit here.
Yeah. All right, so Dan, here, this, normally I would save a question like this for the unlightning round at the end of the show, but I'm gonna hit you with it right now. What's your job?
Oh my God, what is my job? I don't know. I have these sort of three legs. I loved years and years ago Steve Jobs talked about how Apple had like its business was like a three-legged stool.
I remember
and
this.
yeah, it was like I think it was the iPhone and the Mac and maybe the iPod at that point still. God, it was a long time ago. And they always talked about it because like, oh, the Apple TV, it's not ready to be a leg of the stool yet. But I liked that metaphor because it made sense to me, and it was something I've kind of modeled my own life after. Is like if I had just gone into being a straight up like freelance writer after leaving Macworld, I could have done it, but I feel like it would have been a very consuming job because I would have spent a lot of time like doing that hustle and trying to find places to pitch pieces. And it wasn't really, that was not something I was excited about, was doing the like constantly being hungry and having to go out to all these publications and be like, hey, do you want me to write about this? Hey, do you want me to write about this? I wanted a little more chance to do something that was a little more laid back, a little more on my own schedule. And so I was lucky enough to have podcasting as sort of a second leg at that point and be like, you know what, I'm going to do this podcast. I'm going to do Clockwise over at Relay FM. And that's going to give me a little bit of additional income. I didn't think it would be that much at the time. Nowadays, podcasting and writing honestly are about like a 50-50 mix for me for income, which is also bananas.
Yeah.
And then writing, fiction had always for me been the thing that I really wanted to do. And I was aware that like that's not an easy road to get into. It's not something that you can necessarily depend on for a lot of reliable income, but it's something I wanted to work towards. And so, I had been working on books on and off basically my entire life. And it took me a long time to get to the point of actually getting an agent and getting published. And I've discussed some of that over on The Incomparable. But I got to a point where it's like, all right, I actually have gotten a book or two published. I feel like I'm starting to understand this business a little more. And it's, again, not something that is necessarily going to be my prime income generator, but it contributes a little bit, which is great. And it means I can balance all of those things. The tricky part is that where you put your energy isn't always rewarded by a commensurate return in income. So spend a lot of time writing a book doesn't mean I made a lot of money on that book. Whereas maybe I don't spend a ton of time doing, say, Clockwise. It's a half an hour show every week, right? There's other stuff that goes into that. But overall, it's not a show that I spend like a ton of time on. And yet that show does very well, which is great. But it enables me to balance out my life a little bit more by having the freedom to have time to work on projects that aren't necessarily profitable. In that sense, it's kind of like any business, right? Like if you want to go back to the example of Apple again, you have products like the iPhone, which they spend a lot of time developing and spend a lot of money on. And part of the benefit of that is that because the profit, it makes so much money, makes so much profit, you can sort of funnel that back into, let's work on some other stuff that won't necessarily be profitable now, but might in the long term. Movie studios do this too. You get big tentpole releases and those help fund the sort of smaller pictures that are riskier. And so for me, like that's kind of how I view it, is like I'm diversified. Like I'm going to work on a bunch of different stuff, and the stuff that does well is great. I'm going to keep working on that, but I'm also going to use what that sort of affords me to work on projects that are not necessarily as financially, remunerative, but are things that I really want to do. And that there's sort of a hope that I invest more time in this and more energy into this. And maybe someday down the road, it does become a larger chunk of my income. And maybe it's something I can afford to spend more time on, or I can spend time on other new projects that don't necessarily bring in money. So to answer your question, which I totally evaded, I think my full-time job is, I guess, like sort of broadly, I don't want to use the word creator. I feel like that's so overused these days.
No, but you are.
Yeah. That's what I do is I make stuff. And a lot of it is writing. And even if it's talking, I think of that as kind of the similar thing. I don't know. Is that fair? Can I say writing and talking?
That's why I bring... Like in my mind with this show, it's not like talking to the internet is the most general form of talking that you can think about, right? I don't care if you're typing. I don't care if you're doing YouTube videos. I don't care if you're talking into a microphone. If you're communicating over the internet, I just didn't like the phrase communicating on the internet, right? Like I thought talking on the internet.
Less catchy. I agree.
Yeah, exactly, right? So, but before we move, I want to make sure that we plug your three books, right? We're not going to talk about them in detail here because this isn't the context. But can you give us a 60-second pitch on your three books?
Absolutely. So one of the things I love science fiction, especially stuff set in space and sort of space operas. And I love spies. And I decided I wanted to combine those two things. I would love to tell a spy story that's set in space. And so that sort of birthed the idea for this series of novels that I've worked on. The first book I wrote was The Caledonian Gambit, which came out from Talos Press in 2017. And it sort of deals with a covert operative in this galactic Cold War, and he recruits this washed-up pilot to help him track down a super weapon. I then moved publishers, and my second book, which came out last year, The Bayern Agenda, it's set in the same universe, deals with a lot of the same characters, but sort of a new launching off point for this Galactic Cold War series. And that involves a investigation into a planet-sized bank and some shenanigans that are going on there, lots of intrigue. And then the follow-up to the Bayern Agenda, it's called The Aleph Extraction. And this one, I got to mix in another one of my favorite genres, which is the heist. So it takes place largely aboard this sort of luxury cruise liner in space and involves our band of heroes having to steal a storied artifact supposedly created by aliens that might contain the key to some advanced technology. So if you like just sort of fun adventures, it's got humor, it's got a little bit of drama, it's got a lot of action and intrigue. If that's the kind of stuff that you like, I think you will enjoy these books.
Wonderful. And I'll have links to all of those in all of the places where you would find links, so in the show notes and on the website and everything like that. So people can check those out if they're interested in that. Okay, so you hit kind of your separation of time and money and how all that balances out, which I really appreciated your perspective on there, because some of the things that you do that you're, I don't want to say most proud of, or that, you put most of your time in, don't necessarily bring in the most money. And some of the things that bring in your most money, you don't have to work as hard for. So it's kind of funny how that works. Yeah. But one of the next follow-up question is, Dan, where's the YouTube channel? I mean, come on.
It's funny. As we record this today, one of my other friends, Renee Ritchie, who used to work at iMore, has just gone indie on his YouTube channel. And Renee's been doing a ton of YouTube content in the last several years and really killing it. But what he reminds me is that it's hard. YouTube video stuff is hard. I've always loved video stuff. I did some video editing when I was younger. I came across, as I was recently cleaning off some old computers, some old video projects I made while I was in college. And if I had, at one point I had actually, I'll tell you, I applied to go to a bunch of film schools for grad school. I didn't get into any of them, which is why I didn't go into that field. But I love doing it, and I love visual storytelling. And I think some of it is I don't have a really good idea for what kind of video content I would produce. And the other is I could figure out how to do all of it, and I understand some of the fundamentals. I don't have the equipment. I think it's the idea that's really the big problem, right? Like the equipment and the skills, all that stuff is learnable. Yeah. And I've learned a little bit doing some of so we do for Total Party Kill, which is our D&D podcast over in The Incomparable. We do some video content, and I've been learning a little bit about streaming and live broadcasting and stuff over there. But it's not something I've spent a lot of my time and energy on. Funny enough, my publisher for Angry Robot, which has done Bayern and Aleph, asked me if they might do a book video or something before the next book comes out. So I may be looking into that at some point in the not too distant future. But yeah, I think the big thing is I just haven't figured out exactly what that would look like. If people have ideas, if the people are things they want to see in a video from me, I will totally listen to that and I will consider doing it. But right now, I don't know what that would be, but it's cool. I like the idea.
It's so interesting because if you watch, the behind the scenes on some of these big YouTube channels, or even just following, Renee, you bring up Renee, right? Following him on MacBreak Weekly and, through his vector stuff. I feel like every day there's a new gadget, a new widget, a new light, a new something, because it's going to make this thing better. And it does, but it's wow, that's just a process. Holy cow.
Yeah, right.
Go into that visual medium just seems to make it,
it's a lot more complex. I think there's a lot to balance there, right? Even with podcasting is get a good mic. That's 70% of the battle there. It's you can kind of do it on a budget and sound pretty great. Video is a lot harder to do on a budget and have it turn out with that same commensurate level of quality, essentially, because there's just another, not only you're worrying about sound, but now you have to worry about how you look. You got to worry about your backdrop. You got to worry about your lighting. And it's there is a lot that goes into that. There's editing, there's colored time, depending on how much time and energy you want to put in. And the answer is, it's kind of a bottomless pit. You can take as much time and energy as you want to put in it, and money. Let's not forget that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so I'm going to tell you can only do one, right? You're only allowed to do one of the following types of activities. You can either write, and I don't mean write novels. I mean like write tech journalism. You can either write or you can podcast. Which one are you picking?
I got to be honest, right now, like this very day and the very time that we live in, I would say podcast. And honestly, the biggest reason behind that is already even before our current world situation, I work from home. And podcasting is one of the few ways you can hear how animated I am. And that's because I haven't talked to anybody all day. And I think part of it is I like talking to people. I've always been a person who enjoys having a good conversation with someone. And it makes me, especially people who are like make me laugh and who I find insightful, like that's great and it's fun. And the ability to be able to do that and have it be something that other people want to listen to is extremely gratifying for me. And I love writing, and it's not that I would want to, if I had to choose one, I feel like at least I could still get my writing in other forms if it weren't writing for tech sites. And so, but like if you take away the ability to just talk about these things on podcasts with other people, I think I would really be sad. I would be really sad. Whereas if you told me I didn't have to write another, column or another news post for the rest of my life, I would think I would be like, you know what? That's all right. I'll take it.
Okay. All right. I think I can work with that. All right. So what are some challenges? What are some great things, some pros and cons that you've experienced in all of your time talking to the internet?
Well, I mean, so everything is kind of a double-edged sword. So we talked a little bit about being able to get responses. The downside to that is some people are jerks, and it's unfortunate, and it bums me out, right? Like sometimes you'll put things out there and people want to nitpick it, or they want to just tell you how you're wrong. And I think it's really frustrating a lot of times. It's not that people aren't entitled to their opinion, and I think that's fine. You don't like what I write? It's not for everyone. That's totally cool. What I object to is people who feel like they need to tell you that what you did was bad.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
I don't understand what are you getting out of this? Like, aside from some sort of sense of superiority. And I feel like, honestly, if you're doing it, let's be honest, you're not that superior if you're just there critiquing what other people do. Rather see you put that energy into producing something of your own. Heck, if you want to write a blog post that's like refuting something that I wrote or making an argument against it, that's far better than like going to me on Twitter or sending me an email and being like, this was stupid and here's why. It's like, at least you took the time to construct something and put it out there. I have some respect for that. So that's like a big downside of the fact that you're so easily findable and reachable, is that sadly not everybody is going to be respectful of your time and of the energy that you put into things. The other thing, and I mentioned this sort of before, is like the idea of the feeding the beast, as it were. Coming up with content can feel like a treadmill, can feel like a never-ending thing, where it's like, especially now in the era of Twitter and in the era just of electronic media in general, there is such a transience to things. Like, you read something and then you're like, oh yeah, that was great. And then it's gone, right? Because you're on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a struggle with the idea like that you have to keep producing stuff because you're only as good as the last thing that you put out, right? And there's so much media that's like, I got to keep people's attention and keep them from going on to the next thing. I got to keep them here for some time. And so I think the real struggle, and I've dealt with this a bunch in my life, is burnout, is getting to the point where you're like, oh, I don't have anything interesting to say. Everything I want to say has been said by somebody else, and it's been said better. And you can really spend a lot of time sort of, beating yourself up and getting into a funk about it. And I think that's hard. It's hard to be in a position where you're so much of what you're doing depends, or feels like it depends, I should say, on that external validation, on somebody saying this was cool, or I enjoyed this, or getting a link from your favorite blogger, right? Like having them recognize what you do. That is a challenge. I think a lot of people struggle with that, especially people who maybe do really well at the outset, right? Like, oh, hey, here's this exciting new voice on the scene. They have this really interesting thing to say. That's a lot to live up to after that, right? Like, you see the whole sophomore slump thing in a bunch of other different, especially in artistic medium as well. But I think even just with writing about tech news, like you could say something clever and smart and everybody will flock to you one day and they will have forgotten about you by the next day. So dealing with that constant, like, I got to keep producing so I can hit those highs, that's a trap that's very easy to get into. And I think it's one of the best things about going indie is not feeling like I'm as bound to that. Like, yes, I still want to produce good content and I still want people to read it and think positively about it, but I don't feel as much the need to feed the beast and just keep being like, I got to churn stuff out no matter what.
So if somebody's trying to get started doing this, right, where they want to start talking to the internet in whatever form they want to, I know you gave the advice earlier to where, just do, get used to it, just start putting words on the screen or talking into the microphone and those type of things. What other advice do you have for them as they're trying to get rolling into this thing?
I would say, honestly, so that's still the best advice, is to start doing it, right? Like, so even if you decide like halfway through it, you put out like 4 episodes of the podcast and you're like, this didn't go great or whatever, like that can be disheartening. Sticking with it's important, even if it means like, all right, I'll come up with a new idea for a show or another different piece that I want to write about. It's important to sort of keep on the horse because I had a great interchange. A friend of mine, Mike Cole, is an author, and we were on a podcast, which is not out yet, but we recorded a week or two ago. And he said one of the things about writing fiction was, and I think he said it came from someone else to him, was you got to want it more than you want the video games. I was like, that's a great way to put it. Yeah. But yeah, a big part of it is you gotta want to do it more than you want to like spend all your time doing something else, right? Like you got to stick with it. So that's a big part of it. I will say, reaching out to creators that you admire, I think is often really good because especially in podcasting and tech writing, people tend to be responsive. Everybody has a story about how they got started and about how they sort of, got to where they are now. And a lot of those people, in fact, I would say most of them, probably had an experience where they reached out to someone else who they view as a mentor or someone they admired, and that sort of helped them on their road. I know that's true for me, and I think it's true pretty universally. So you can always, just be respectful and polite of people's time. But, if you write someone and say, hey, I really like what you're doing, this is what I'm doing, maybe this will be of interest to you, or hey, what do you suggest if I'm doing this thing and I ran into this problem or something like that? I think people tend to be very kind and generous in our area, in our community, especially. I think that's a big thing. I mean, obviously, some people are going to be much busier and have harder times with that. So reaching out to like Stephen King or the people who make cereal, probably not going to go as well. But like if there's like a small indie creator that you like and you're just like, hey, I like what you do, I'd love to do something similar, you might find that they're pretty responsive to that. So I feel like that's a good place to go. And
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Even in starting this show, I won't name any names, but there are a few people that I just couldn't believe, one, that they even responded, and then two, that they were just willing to share important and relevant things that were very, very helpful, even though it maybe took 2 minutes for them to send the email. But it was like, oh my gosh, like that's makes so much sense, and I hadn't thought about that, and thank you so much.
Well, and those people remember you later, and like, maybe when you tweet about it, they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Then they sort of we all lift each other up, right? Like that's the biggest trap that I don't want people to get into, is the idea of this sort of like, zero-sum game when it comes to our kind of content. It's not like helping somebody else hurts you, right? Like it doesn't, making somebody else like succeed at what they're doing is not a detriment to your own success. It's beneficial. We all lift each other up. Rising tide lifts all boats. I think that's the most important thing, is like you kind of got to find a way to help other people along, because frankly, you were helped, right? Like nobody came into this field and was like, I've got a brilliant idea and I'll do it all by myself. Like that's just not how it works.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it there. Wise words from Dan Moren.
Put that on my tombstone.
Put it on my tombstone. All right. So here we go. The unlightning round.
Oh boy.
The slowest, fastest questions you will ever respond to. Here we go. Overall, what is your favorite content on the internet?
Oh my God, my favorite content on the internet. Right now, I will say, so I love stuff that makes me laugh. It's very rare that I find a podcast that will make me, like, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. And so I feel like when I find one that really like tickles me, I tend to stick with it. So there's a Australian show called Dragon Friends, which is a D&D show, but it's basically a bunch of comedians and media personalities from Australia playing D&D, and when they start, they have no idea what they're doing. But it's incredibly funny, and to the point where, especially with recent events being what they are, I found myself really in need of a good laugh. And so I turned on the latest couple episodes of that, and I was driving my car, and I was lucky I didn't crash into something. I was laughing so hard. So right now, that's certainly near the top. I'm sure I'm forgetting other fantastic things, but it's the thing that sort of popped to mind just because it's the thing that's given me some of the most joy recently, and that's not nothing.
Alrighty, your favorite personality on the internet?
Oh my God, my favorite personality on the internet. Wow. Well, I know a lot of personalities, and that's one of the things that is a bit tricky. Oh my God, this is
Yes.
I'm feeling like whew,
this is why it's the lightning round. It started out
I'm
as the lightning round, and then nobody could answer these questions as fast as I wanted them to.
Hard.
Yeah.
It is hard. I am not prepared. Oh, there are so many good people on the internet. I would say that my favorite personality on the internet is probably, I'm stalling. This is what I do when I stall, is I just sort of talk and I eventually come up with something.
Just
and,
pick somebody.
I'm dying. I will pick, I would pick Ryan North. I don't know if you know Ryan North. He's a comics writer.
Okay.
He did Marvel's run on the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, which is really fantastic. He's hilarious. He's great on Twitter. I really enjoy reading him. Frequently, I see tweets of his that make me laugh a lot, and I send to my wife. So yeah, go check him out. I think I'm going to see if I can find his Twitter address. I think he's at Ryan Q North. He's very funny. He's written a bunch of other books too that are very amusing as well. So recommend that.
Okay, you're only allowed to listen to or watch one show. What do you watch or listen to?
One show. Okay, it'll probably be TV because I spend a lot of time watching TV these days. And I would say if there's a show that I just am always excited when it comes back, I think these days it's probably The Expanse. I love those books, and the show is great. I just really enjoy it. It's gotten better every season, and I just enjoy those characters, and it looks great. It's just such a cool sci-fi show. So I really, really like it. It's not a surprising one, but I'll put that out there.
Okay. Last question.
Okay.
As someone with 61,600 tweets,
oh my God,
and by my quick math, that's about 13 tweets a day.
Stop making me feel so old.
since you joined Twitter. You talk a lot on the internet there too.
Yeah, that's true.
Just tell us a good Twitter story.
A good Twitter story. Well, oh my God. A good Twitter story. I've had some great interactions on Twitter over there. Okay, here's my good Twitter story. I got it. So one of my favorite movies from last year was Knives Out. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yes,
it's
very
great.
good.
It's fantastic. Rian Johnson is the director. He did The Last Jedi. I've been a fan of his for years, since the original movie Brick that he did, 15 years ago, probably. Anyways, I don't know how we got started in this, but last year I got married, and one of the things that my wife and I really wanted to do at the place that we got married is it was set on this historical estate, and they had this library. And we had really had this idea of we wanted to do a great picture in the library with a bunch of us looking at books or doing this stuff. We didn't quite get that, but essentially what we got was this group shot with my wife and I sitting on the couch and all of our wedding party behind us in the library. And it's got this very dramatic lighting to it, and it looks very atmospheric. And so one of the things they told us during the picture taking was look at who you think the murderer is. And so it's a bunch of us looking at different people in the wedding party. But anyways, what I noticed was that it was very similar in composition to some of the press shots of the ensemble cast for Knives Out. And so I posted a tweet that was one of these is Knives Out and one of these is our wedding, but which is which? And I think I tagged Rian Johnson in it. And he not only liked the tweet, but he responded to me and said, I think yours is better lit than ours. And I sent that to my wife immediately, Rian Johnson likes our wedding photo. Just the idea that he even saw our wedding photo, much less took the time to look at it and admire it, was like the most flattering thing that I think has ever happened to me on the internet. So that was, and again, that just goes back to the idea of like the fact that you can reach out to these people. It's like, when else would I talk to Ryan Johnson? But like, it was amazing that he just took the second out to just like say, I like your wedding photos, essentially. And I was like, you made my day, possibly my year.
That's awesome. That's awesome. All right. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining the show. Thank you so much for telling your story. Learned a lot and just had a really great time. So, where can people find more about you?
Well, always a good place to start is dmoren.com, which is my website. It's got links to all my books, got links to all my podcasts, links to the places I write tech columns, Twitter, Instagram, stuff like that. I'm pretty much D Moren anywhere on the internet, including Twitter and Instagram. So if, you see a D Moren out there, it's probably me, not 100%, but most likely. So yeah, that's a good place to start.
Wonderful. For those of you who are coming back for the second episode or the third episode or the fourth episode or the fifth episode, thank you so much. We really appreciate you listening. You can find out more on Twitter at TTTI Podcast or on the website talkingtotheinternet.com. I'd really appreciate it if you'd share the show with your friends that you might think be interested in it, or even leave us a little bit of a review somewhere on the internet. That helps get the word out as well. So thanks so much, everybody. Look forward to learning with you in the future.
This has been a Schwa Schwa production.